Some distance doesn't need words to make itself clear. There's a specific kind of shift that happens in relationships, one that doesn't announce itself through conflict or confrontation, but through the slow, quiet recalibration of emotional behavior. It's not always obvious at first. The other person is still there, still responding, still maintaining the appearance of connection. But underneath that surface, something fundamental has changed. The rhythm feels different. The ease that once existed between two people begins to thin, and what remains is a kind of functional interaction that resembles closeness, but no longer carries its weight. This isn't about drama. It's about pattern. And patterns, when consistent enough, speak with more clarity than any conversation ever could. What we're examining here isn't a single moment of rupture. It's the gradual accumulation of behavioral shifts that, over time, form a recognizable structure. Relationship psychology teaches us that emotional distance rarely emerges from nowhere. It builds through repeated micro-absences, through the quiet redistribution of attention and effort, through the slow erosion of reciprocal investment. These shifts operate beneath conscious awareness for a long time before they become undeniable. The person experiencing them often questions their own perception, wondering if they're reading too much into small things, if they're being oversensitive, if the distance is temporary or structural. But the body knows before the mind does. The nervous system registers what words refuse to confirm. This analysis isn't about assigning blame or labeling anyone as wrong. It's about understanding how attachment patterns and psychological dynamics shape the way people move through relational space. How some withdraw when overwhelmed. How others compensate when they sense instability. How silence itself becomes a form of communication. What we're looking at is the architecture of emotional withdrawal. How it forms, how it sustains itself, how it reshapes the relational foundation without ever being directly addressed. We're not here to judge the behavior. We're here to observe it, to name it, and to understand what it reveals about the way emotional investment shifts over time when one person begins to pull away and the other is left trying to make sense of the absence. The moment emotional distance becomes impossible to ignore isn't a single event. It's a threshold. It's the point where the accumulation of behavioral evidence can no longer be minimized, reframed, or explained away. And once that threshold is crossed, everything changes. Not because something dramatic has happened, but because clarity has arrived. What follows is an investigation into that process. The early signs, the internal confusion, the attempts at reinterpretation, the slow recognition of pattern, and finally, the quiet acceptance that the distance is real, sustained, and no longer something that can be reasoned away. This is where we begin. There's a specific moment when something in the emotional rhythm shifts. It doesn't announce itself. There's no argument, no raised voice, no explicit withdrawal. What happens is quieter. The other person is still present in form, still responding when spoken to, still performing the basic gestures that maintain the appearance of connection. But underneath that surface, something fundamental has changed. The emotional texture feels different. The ease that once existed between two people begins to thin, and what remains is a kind of functional interaction that resembles closeness, but no longer carries its weight. It's not dramatic. It's not even fully clear yet. It's just off. At this stage, there's no language for it. The person on the receiving end can't yet articulate what they're sensing, because the behavior itself hasn't crossed any obvious line. Nothing has been said. Nothing has been done. And yet, the feeling persists. It shows up in small ways. Responses that arrive a little slower, conversations that end a little sooner, silences that stretch just beyond comfort. These aren't isolated incidents. They begin to form a subtle but consistent backdrop, a low hum of absence that runs beneath the relationship. The mind tries to locate a reason, scanning recent interactions for something that might explain the shift. But often, there's nothing concrete to point to. Just a growing sense that the emotional ground has become less stable. What makes this moment so disorienting is that it exists in a space where attachment patterns and psychological dynamics are already at work, but neither person has named them yet. The one pulling back may not even be aware they're doing it. The one feeling the distance may question whether they're imagining it, whether they're being too sensitive, whether this is just a temporary mood or external stress bleeding into the relationship. There's a strong internal resistance to labeling it as something real. Because once it's named, it becomes harder to ignore. So instead, it lingers in the background, felt but not spoken, sensed but not confronted. The relationship continues, but with a new undertone of vigilance, a quiet monitoring of emotional behavior that wasn't there before. This is where emotional distance first becomes noticeable, not through a single event, but through the slow accumulation of small behavioral shifts that don't yet have a story attached to them. The person begins to watch more closely, searching for clues in tone, timing, presence. They start to notice patterns in how affection is offered or withheld, how attention is distributed, how emotional space is managed. And while nothing has been confirmed, the body already knows. The nervous system registers what the mind refuses to accept. Something in the relational foundation has loosened, and the instinct to investigate, quietly, carefully, has begun. The shifts don't arrive with explanations. They show up in the structure of daily interaction, in the way time and attention are allocated, in the subtle recalibration of emotional availability. There's no confrontation, no accusation, no moment where someone says they need space. Instead, what emerges is a quiet rearrangement of priorities. Plans that used to form naturally now require more effort to coordinate. Conversations that once flowed without friction now feel slightly mechanical, as if both people are going through motions rather than engaging with real presence. The other person is still there, still responding, still participating, but the quality of that participation has thinned. What was once effortless now carries a faint undertone of obligation. These early behavioral shifts operate in a gray zone where nothing is wrong enough to justify concern. Yet nothing feels entirely right either. The person begins to notice small inconsistencies, texts that take longer to return, enthusiasm that doesn't match the moment, affection that feels more reflexive than intentional. There's a growing sense that emotional energy is being redirected elsewhere, not necessarily towards someone else, but simply away. The relationship becomes less of a priority without ever being deprioritized out loud. This creates a specific kind of unease, one that doesn't have a clear target. There's no villain, no betrayal, no dramatic rupture. Just a quiet erosion of the emotional infrastructure that once held everything together. What complicates this phase is that the behavior itself is often defensible. The other person hasn't done anything overtly wrong. They haven't lied, disappeared, or violated any spoken boundary. If questioned, they can point to external factors, work stress, fatigue, personal concerns, that justify the emotional withdrawal without naming it as such. And because these explanations are partially true, they become easy to accept. The person on the receiving end wants to believe that the distance is temporary, that once the external pressure lifts, the connection will return to its former state. So they absorb the shifts, adjust their expectations, and continue forward. But the unease doesn't disappear. It settles deeper, becoming part of the relational atmosphere. This is where relationship dynamics begin to show their architecture. Attachment patterns, whether secure or avoidant, start influencing how both people interpret and respond to the distance. The one feeling the shift may become hypervigilant, scanning for reassurance that doesn't come as easily anymore. The one creating the distance may retreat further in response to that vigilance, experiencing it as pressure rather than connection. Neither is acting with malice. Both are responding to their own psychological dynamics, their own history of emotional behavior, their own internal sense of safety. But the gap widens, and because it's happening without language, without acknowledgement, it becomes harder to address. The relationship enters a phase of silent negotiation, where both people are adjusting to something neither has agreed to name. Absence doesn't always look like physical departure. Sometimes it shows up as a series of small withdrawals, moments where the other person is present in body but not in attention, where they respond but don't initiate, where they participate but don't invest. These aren't grand gestures of abandonment. They're micro-absences, brief but consistent, that begin to alter the rhythm of the relationship. A conversation ends sooner than it used to. A question goes unanswered for hours, then days. Plans are made, but lack the same anticipation. Touch becomes less frequent, or when it does happen, it feels more procedural than affectionate. None of these things alone would constitute evidence, but together, they form a pattern. The emotional rhythm of a relationship operates on repetition. It's built through small, repeated acts of attention, checking in, asking follow-up questions, initiating contact, offering presence without being prompted. When those acts begin to fade, the rhythm changes. What was once reciprocal starts to feel one-sided. The person who notices this shift often tries to compensate, increasing their own effort to restore balance. They reach out more, ask more questions, create more opportunities for connection. But the response doesn't match the input. The other person engages just enough to maintain the appearance of normalcy, but not enough to rebuild what's been lost. This creates a specific kind of exhaustion, not from conflict, but from carrying the relationship's emotional weight alone. What makes these absences so disorienting is their subtlety. They don't trigger the defense mechanisms that open conflict would. There's no clear moment to point to and say, "This is when things changed." Instead, the change happens in the gaps, in what isn't said, what isn't offered, what isn't initiated. The person begins to feel the weight of their own presence in the relationship, noticing how often they're the one creating momentum, how rarely the other person steps forward without being prompted. This awareness doesn't come all at once. It builds slowly, through repeated exposure to the same behavioral pattern. And each small absence reinforces the same quiet message. The emotional investment is no longer equal. Over time, these micro-absences compound. They stop feeling random and start feeling systematic. The person realizes they're not dealing with occasional distraction or temporary stress. They're witnessing a shift in emotional behavior that has become the new baseline. The other person isn't pulling away in moments. They're pulling away in general. And while they may not have consciously decided to create distance, their actions speak with more clarity than their words. The relationship begins to operate on a different frequency, one where emotional presence is no longer assumed, where connection requires constant effort, and where the absence of that effort becomes the loudest communication of all. There's a phase where the mind refuses to accept permanence. The distance is real, the behavioral shifts are undeniable, but the person on the receiving end still can't determine whether this is a temporary withdrawal or a fundamental change in the relationship's foundation. This uncertainty creates a specific kind of psychological tension. Every small gesture of warmth feels like evidence that things might return to normal. Every extended silence feels like confirmation that they won't. The person oscillates between hope and resignation, unable to settle into either. They search for clues in every interaction, trying to read intention into behavior that may not carry any conscious intent at all. What complicates this phase is that the other person often doesn't provide clarity. They may not know themselves whether the distance is temporary or structural. They might be experiencing their own internal conflict, their own confusion about what they want or need from the relationship. Or they may be aware that something has shifted but unwilling to name it, either because they fear the consequences or because they haven't yet processed it themselves. This creates a relational deadlock, where one person is seeking understanding and the other is withholding, not out of cruelty, but out of their own avoidance or uncertainty. The result is a relationship that exists in limbo, neither fully connected nor fully severed. The confusion intensifies because human behavior rarely follows clean narratives. The same person who seems distant one week may re-engage the next, offering just enough warmth to reset expectations. This intermittent reinforcement makes it nearly impossible to draw conclusions. The person begins to doubt their own perception, wondering if they've misread the situation, if they've been too reactive, if they've created a problem where none exists. They replay conversations, analyze timing, search for alternative explanations. But beneath all that mental effort, the body holds a different truth. The nervous system has already registered the shift. The emotional instinct knows what the mind is still trying to rationalize away. This is where attachment patterns and psychological dynamics collide most visibly. The person experiencing the distance may become hyper-aware of every emotional cue, scanning for reassurance that the connection is still intact. They may suppress their own needs to avoid creating conflict, hoping that by staying calm and accommodating, they can preserve what's left. Or they may become more vocal, seeking direct answers to questions the other person isn't ready to address. Either response is an attempt to resolve the uncertainty, to force the ambiguity into something definable. But the distance itself resists definition. It continues to exist in the space between words, in the absence of clear communication, in the unspoken shift that both people can feel but neither has agreed to name. At some point, the effort becomes visible. Not through any single moment, but through the accumulation of interactions where one person is consistently doing more, initiating more conversations, asking more questions, creating more opportunities for connection, offering more reassurance, carrying more of the emotional labor that keeps the relationship intact. The other person responds, but their responses lack reciprocal energy. They engage when prompted, but they don't prompt in return. They participate, but they don't lead. The imbalance isn't deliberate, at least not consciously, but it's unmistakable. And once noticed, it's nearly impossible to unsee. This imbalance shifts the entire relational structure. What was once a shared effort becomes one-sided maintenance. The person investing more begins to feel the weight of that disparity, not as anger, not yet, but as a quiet exhaustion. They notice how often they're the one checking in, how rarely the other person reaches out without being reached first. They notice how their enthusiasm is met with muted response, how their attempts at depth are redirected toward surface-level exchanges. The relationship starts to feel like something they're holding up alone, and the act of holding it becomes increasingly effortful. There's a growing awareness that if they stopped reaching out, the silence might stretch indefinitely. What makes this phase so psychologically complex is that the person exerting more effort often blames themselves. They wonder if they're being too demanding, if their expectations are unrealistic, if they're creating pressure where none should exist. They internalize the imbalance as a personal failing rather than recognizing it as a behavioral pattern emerging from the other person's emotional withdrawal. This self-doubt is reinforced by the lack of open conflict. Because nothing dramatic has happened, because the other person hasn't explicitly pulled away, it becomes easy to question whether the imbalance is even real. But the evidence is there, quietly accumulating in every interaction where effort and response fail to align. Over time, this imbalance erodes the sense of emotional safety that relationships depend on. The person begins to feel uncertain about where they stand, unsure whether their presence is still valued or merely tolerated. They stop initiating as freely, not because they've decided to withdraw, but because they've grown tired of carrying the connection alone. The relationship enters a state of quiet negotiation, where both people are waiting for the other to step forward, and neither does. The distance that was once subtle becomes structural, no longer something that might resolve on its own, but something that now defines the relationship's baseline. And still, neither person has spoken it aloud. When faced with sustained emotional distance, the mind instinctively searches for counter-evidence. It reaches back into the relationship's history, pulling forward moments of closeness, shared vulnerability, past expressions of affection. The person recalls conversations where the other person said they cared, moments where they showed up without hesitation, times when the connection felt effortless and mutual. These memories become anchor points, evidence that the distance now being experienced doesn't represent the full truth of the relationship. The person tells themselves that what they had before is still real, that the current withdrawal is an anomaly, that the person they knew is still there beneath the surface, just temporarily obscured. This reinterpretation serves a psychological function. It delays the acceptance of loss. It allows the person to maintain hope without confronting the possibility that the emotional foundation has fundamentally shifted. They begin to attribute the detachment to external factors, stress, exhaustion, life circumstances, rather than to a change in emotional investment. They remind themselves that the other person has been distant before and returned. They focus on the exceptions rather than the patterns, on the rare moments of warmth rather than the sustained absence. This selective attention isn't delusional. It's a form of emotional self-protection, a way of preserving the relationship's meaning while refusing to accept that its structure has changed. But reinterpretation has limits. the longer the distance persists, the harder it becomes to reconcile past closeness with present behavior. The person begins to notice the growing gap between what the relationship once was and what it has become. They start to question whether the closeness they remember was as mutual as it felt, whether the other person experienced the connection with the same depth, whether the emotional investment was ever truly balanced. These doubts don't arrive as sudden realizations. They creep in slowly, undermining the narrative the person has been holding on to. And as that narrative weakens, the discomfort intensifies. Because if the past can't explain the present, then the present has to be faced on its own terms. This is where psychological dynamics and attachment patterns reveal themselves most clearly. The person invested in preserving the relationship may cling to past closeness as evidence of future potential, hoping that by recalling what was good, they can reignite what's been lost. But emotional behavior doesn't respond to memory. It responds to present action, to consistent patterns, to what's actually being offered now. And when the present continues to contradict the past, the mind eventually reaches a point where reinterpretation stops working. The shared meaning that once held the relationship together no longer aligns with the emotional reality unfolding in real time. And that misalignment becomes impossible to ignore. Reassurance, in healthy relational dynamics, doesn't need to be requested. It exists as a natural byproduct of consistent emotional behavior, through presence, through follow-through, through small acts of attention that communicate investment without needing to be named. It shows up in the way someone checks in without being prompted, in the way they remember details, in the way they offer certainty when uncertainty arises. But when emotional distance settles into a relationship, reassurance becomes something that has to be sought rather than given. The person no longer receives it organically. They have to ask for it. And even when they do, what they receive often feels hollow, more like appeasement than genuine connection. This shift is deeply destabilizing. The person begins to notice how often they're left in a state of emotional ambiguity, unsure where they stand, unsure whether the relationship is stable or quietly dissolving. They find themselves scanning for signs of commitment, analyzing tone and timing, searching for confirmation that they haven't been reading the distance wrong. But the other person doesn't offer that confirmation. They remain vague, non-committal, or they provide just enough reassurance to prevent a confrontation without addressing the underlying pattern. The result is a relationship where emotional security is constantly in question, where the person has to manage their own uncertainty without external support. What makes this particularly painful is the contrast with how things used to be. There was a time when reassurance came easily, when the other person's presence itself was reassuring. Now that presence feels conditional, uncertain, as if it could be withdrawn at any moment without warning. The person realizes they've become hypervigilant, monitoring the relationship's stability in real time, trying to anticipate the next withdrawal before it happens. This vigilance is exhausting. It turns the relationship into something that requires constant emotional management, rather than something that provides refuge. And the more the person seeks reassurance, the more the other person seems to retreat, creating a cycle where both people are reinforcing the very distance they claim not to want. Over time, the absence of natural reassurance becomes its own message. It signals that the emotional investment has changed, that the other person is no longer operating from a place of secure attachment, that something fundamental in the relational foundation has loosened. The person stops asking for reassurance, not because they no longer need it, but because they've learned that asking doesn't yield what they're searching for. They begin to internalize the uncertainty, accepting that the relationship no longer offers the emotional stability it once did. And in that acceptance, something shifts. The need for reassurance doesn't disappear, but the expectation of receiving it does. The person begins to prepare, quietly, for what that absence might eventually mean. Self-protection doesn't announce itself. It emerges slowly, as a response to sustained emotional instability. The person doesn't wake up one day and decide to guard themselves. They simply stop offering as freely as they once did. They become more measured in their expressions of affection, more cautious in their vulnerability, more selective about what they share. This isn't withdrawal in the way the other person has been withdrawing. It's a recalibration, a quiet adjustment to the reality that the relationship no longer feels emotionally safe. The person begins to hold something back, not out of spite, but out of survival. They've learned, through repeated experience, that openness isn't being met with openness, that effort isn't being matched, that emotional investment isn't being reciprocated. This shift in behavior is often misread by the other person. They may interpret it as distance, as coldness, as the beginning of an ending. But it's not. It's adaptation. The person isn't leaving. They're protecting themselves from the ongoing uncertainty that the other person has created. They're reducing their exposure to emotional risk because the relational environment has become unpredictable. They're no longer willing to carry the full weight of the connection alone, no longer willing to absorb the imbalance without adjustment. This doesn't mean they've stopped caring. It means they've stopped expecting the relationship to provide what it once did. And that expectation shift, quiet as it is, changes everything. What makes this phase so psychologically significant is that it marks a transition from reactive behavior to protective behavior. Up until this point, the person has been trying to understand the distance, to accommodate it, to work around it. But now, they're responding to it. They're creating their own boundaries, their own emotional distance, their own version of withdrawal. This isn't retaliation, it's self-preservation. The relationship has taught them that full emotional investment isn't sustainable under current conditions, so they adjust their investment accordingly. They stop initiating as often. They stop seeking reassurance. They stop trying to bridge the gap. Not because they want the distance to grow, but because they can no longer afford to be the only one fighting against it. This is where relationship dynamics reach a critical threshold. Both people are now operating from a place of self-protection. Both are withholding. Both are waiting for the other to step forward. The emotional rhythm that once held them together has fractured. And because neither person is addressing the pattern openly, the distance becomes self-reinforcing. What began as one person's withdrawal has now become mutual, though for different reasons. One person withdrew to create space, the other withdrew to survive it. And in that mutual retreat, the relationship enters a new phase, one where both people are still present, still technically together, but no longer emotionally connected in any meaningful way. The question is no longer whether the distance exists, it's whether either person is willing to name it. Response here, a canceled plan there, a conversation that felt off, begin to coalesce into a recognizable pattern. The behavior is no longer random, it's systematic. The other person isn't occasionally distant. They're consistently distant. They aren't temporarily preoccupied. They've restructured their emotional availability in a way that has become the new baseline. And once that pattern becomes visible, it can't be unseen. The person realizes they're not dealing with a rough patch or external stress bleeding into the relationship. They're dealing with a fundamental shift in how the other person engages. This recognition doesn't come as a single revelation. It builds gradually, through repeated exposure to the same behavioral cycles. The person notices that reassurance, when it does come, is always reactive, never proactive. They notice that warmth appears only in response to pressure, never spontaneously. They notice that the other person's engagement follows a predictable rhythm: withdrawal, confrontation, temporary reconnection, followed by withdrawal again. These cycles repeat, sometimes over days, sometimes over weeks, but the underlying structure remains the same. And with each repetition, the pattern becomes harder to deny. The person is no longer confused about what's happening. They're just deciding what to do about it. What makes this phase so psychologically significant is that it shifts the internal narrative from hope to assessment. The person is no longer waiting for things to return to how they were. They're evaluating whether the relationship, as it currently exists, is something they want to remain in. They're weighing the emotional cost of staying against the uncertainty of leaving. They're asking themselves whether the connection they once had is still present in any meaningful form, or whether they've been holding on to a version of the relationship that no longer exists. These aren't easy questions, and they don't have immediate answers, but the fact that they're being asked at all signals a shift. The person has moved from accommodation to evaluation. This is where psychological dynamics and emotional behavior intersect most clearly. The person isn't making decisions based on isolated incidents anymore. They're reading the relationship as a whole, looking at the cumulative evidence of how the other person shows up, or doesn't. They're recognizing that behavior, over time, reveals more than words ever do. And the behavior they've been witnessing has been consistent, not in its presence, but in its absence. Not in what's being offered, but in what's being withheld. The pattern is clear. The person has been pulling away, not in moments, but in structure. And that recognition, quiet as it is, marks the beginning of a different kind of clarity, one that no longer depends on hope or reinterpretation, but on what's actually been happening all along. There comes a moment when the distance stops being something the person can rationalize away. All the explanations that once made sense, stress, timing, external circumstances, no longer hold weight against the accumulation of evidence. The other person's behavior has been consistent enough, sustained enough, that it can no longer be attributed to temporary factors. The distance isn't a phase. It's a position, and once that becomes undeniable, the entire relational framework shifts. The person stops trying to make sense of the distance and starts accepting it as the reality they're living in. This acceptance doesn't arrive as relief. It arrives as a quiet, sobering clarity. What makes this point so definitive is that it marks the end of internal negotiation. Up until now, the person has been oscillating between doubt and hope, between questioning their perception and trusting it. But at this stage, the ambiguity collapses. The pattern is too clear, the behavioral evidence too consistent. The person realizes that no matter how they reframe the situation, the emotional distance remains. No matter how much they adjust their expectations, the imbalance persists. The relationship has fundamentally changed, and the other person has shown, through sustained behavior, that they're either unwilling or unable to bridge the gap. This realization doesn't come with anger. It comes with a kind of stillness, a recognition that the relationship can no longer be maintained on hope alone. This is the point where psychological dynamics reach their inevitable conclusion. The person who has been carrying the relationship, who has been compensating for the other person's withdrawal, who has been managing their own uncertainty without support, they finally stop. Not because they've decided to leave necessarily, but because they've accepted that the relationship as it exists now cannot provide what they need. They stop seeking reassurance that doesn't come. They stop initiating connection that isn't reciprocated. They stop trying to restore something that the other person has already let go of. This isn't defeat. It's clarity. And with that clarity comes a different kind of question. Not whether the distance exists, but what to do now that its existence is undeniable. The emotional distance that began as something vague and unnamed has now solidified into the defining feature of the relationship. It's no longer something happening in the background. It's the foreground. And the person is no longer confused about what they're experiencing. They know. They've watched the pattern repeat enough times to understand that this is who the other person has become in this relationship. Whether by choice or circumstance, whether conscious or not. The distance is real. The withdrawal is real. And the person is finally ready to stop minimizing it, stop reframing it, and start confronting what it actually means for them to stay in a relationship where emotional presence has become the exception, not the rule. That confrontation, quiet as it may be, is where everything shifts. Emotional distance doesn't resolve through hope. It resolves through acknowledgement. What we've examined here isn't speculation. It's the behavioral architecture of withdrawal, mapped through consistent patterns that speak louder than any explanation ever could. The person who pulls away rarely announces their departure. They simply redistribute their presence until absence becomes the baseline. And the person left witnessing that shift eventually reaches a point where reinterpretation stops working, where the gap between past closeness and present behavior can no longer be bridged by memory or goodwill. That point isn't failure, it's clarity. And clarity, however uncomfortable, is the only foundation from which real decisions can be made. The question was never whether the distance existed. It was whether you were ready to stop minimizing it. Now you know. The pattern has revealed itself. What you do with that knowledge is entirely yours to navigate. But one thing is certain. Behavior that repeats is behavior that has been chosen, consciously or not. And when someone shows you, through sustained action, where you stand in their emotional landscape, you don't need their words to confirm it. You already have all the evidence you need. If this analysis resonated with you, there's something you need to understand about what happened before the distance even became visible. Because emotional withdrawal doesn't start with absence, it starts with silence. And not just any silence. The kind that stops feeling neutral and starts feeling like a message you're not supposed to ask about. That shift, the moment silence becomes loaded, deliberate, and emotionally coded, is where everything begins to unravel. I covered that entire dynamic in the previous video. The moment silence stopped feeling neutral. If you haven't watched it yet, you need to. It's not optional if you're serious about understanding how these patterns form. That video breaks down the psychological mechanics of how silence transforms from comfortable space into emotional distance. Watch it, understand it, then come back here. Because once you see how silence operates as behavior, everything else I've shown you in this video will make even more sense. If you want to keep learning how relationship psychology actually works, Not the surface-level advice, but the real behavioral patterns that shape emotional dynamics. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications. This is where we break it down. No fluff, no motivational phrases, just observation, analysis, and clarity.